substance known as LSD and the ancient English text known as Beowulf are two things you might not consider connected at all. And indeed, for most people, they aren't. They are two completely different things in two completely different categories. One dates only to about 100 years ago. The other is the oldest literature text in the English language. But when personal circumstances and personal stories come into the mix, in my case, they did end up connected. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about the experience itself. I won't go into dates or circumstances too much, but I was at an event and the event wasn't exactly to my tastes exactly. The music wasn't really my thing. There's quite strange people around and things like that. And if you ever watch or listen or read things about psychedelics, people will always say that circumstance and place is very important with psychedelics, and it very much determines how the trip plays out and how you enjoy the trip or whether you enjoy it or not. In my case, I was in quite a dark room. Like I said, music wasn't exactly to my liking, kind of like bizarre kind of people going on. And for reference, I took a small square tab, a full dose of a tab, and you kind of sit back, and this is going to sound incredibly stereotypical, but everything kind of just changes around you. I think the most noticeable things I can call out were pattern shifting and shapes and colour shifting. So I'd look at something as simple as the wall, and it would be lines going the opposite way, rows going the opposite way of differing kind of shapes. Simple shapes, maybe circles, triangles, squares, diamond kind of shapes, going opposite way each other, constantly shifting up, around, left and right. The predominant colours being green and purple. The best way I can describe the pattern is kind of patterns on the walls of pyramids and a kind of pharaoh's tombs, the kind of gridding they'd have on that. But then as my mind kind of settled further into the trip, symbols of mythical texts and cultures kind of began appearing, particularly of Germanic and kind of Celtic mythological runes and symbols and stories and things like this. I'm an enjoyer of kind of mythical texts from all cultures, but particularly I enjoy ones from the Celtic and Germanic kind of pantheons, I suppose, and culture stories. So things like the Havamal or the Tain or Harfankel saga or the Nibelungenlied. I always butcher pronunciation of that. And most chiefly to this, Beowulf. I think that's because when your mind is chemically altered, first off, it views things, whether it's images or what you're being told or this, you feel it a lot more deeply. Everything seems a lot more important than it actually is. And that can include what you see, which is not what you're actually seeing, but the visual images your mind conjures, it usually anchors to things you like and you find symbolically important. So that I'd say that's why different kind of symbols, different tapestries started appearing in my eye. And I'm not saying all this to try and send a message or convey that what I was seeing on the trip was important or life-changing, or I'm not trying to say, it opened my mind's eye, it really was profound, it was incredibly profound. Not really at all, because for the whole time, I was lucky that because of the dosage I took, I didn't experience any feelings of depersonalization or derealization. No matter how strong the visuals I was seeing were, the things I was hearing, things like that. I knew who I was, and I knew where I was. I knew what the time was. I knew what day it was. I knew what was going on. And while like I did feel this kind of sense of rootedness and calm from what I saw, I knew what I was seeing was not real. On top of the fact that what I was seeing was not real, the afterwards, the kind of after effect, if you don't know, the dosage, or at least the full tab dosage of LSD lasts a long time. You don't fully become sober again for about 12 hours until after you first take it. And afterwards, I just felt very mentally exhausted and kind of tired, and I felt a bit out of it and a bit flat for the next few days. So if anything about that's your drug PSA, I'd say take that away. I went on a trip, not that kind of trip, a travelling holiday, I suppose, to Denmark. And I stayed in Copenhagen. And to talk about Copenhagen first before I get into anything else about the Danish countryside or Beowulf or anything like that, I think as many people say who visit Copenhagen, they always say the same thing. It's very clean, it's very well designed, it's very well gridded out. The roads are really big there, but it's not congested with cars because it's they've got the train, they've got they've got loads of people bike, and the underground as well, things like that. It's just such an accessible, walkable, and livable city. I mean, I think it was ranked #1 livable city. I'm not sure by who. I don't know. Vienna was number 2. Vienna is the only city that really rivals it in that regard. And I have been to Vienna. Vienna as well is a very lovely city, but Copenhagen just really stood out to me. But on top of that, even though it's a metropole, when you kind of just look a little bit around and what you see, the architecture and things like that. But further back than that, when you look at, like, if you go and see the statue of the lure blowers, the 2 guys with the kind of horn, that's kind of Beowulf era imagery. And I was slowly like starting to see these things, and I was like, like this kind of seems familiar to me, like to things I've read specifically about things like Beowulf from our own culture and Anglo-Saxon history and things like that. And I was like, this is I recognise this. But this kind of bubbled away under the surface until I was conducting my field research outside of Copenhagen, which I took the train for. I didn't take any other. I took the bus a few times as well in very kind of remote areas of Zealand. I think again, simple observations I can start with were lots of green fields, and kind of rolling hills. The green fields were kind of around places I visited, like kind of flat, kind of rolling hills, around places like Gadstrup and Vig. Whereas like the kind of rolling hills areas was around, I never know how to pronounce the place, but it's Oldshurud, which is home to a UNESCO geopark. It's kind of big rolling hills, and I'd be sat there and I'd kind of look out the window while I was on the train, and I'd be thinking, you could tell me I was on the train back home on like East Midlands Rail, and I'd be going through, I don't know, Cambridgeshire or Northamptonshire, and you tell me, you're on East Midlands Rail right now, and I would have believed you, because what I was seeing, the landscape just to begin with, kind of struck me as something so similar to England in many ways, and I was just like, wow. I could close my eyes and open them back up, and I could imagine I'm just still in England. And then also travelling around the countryside, the architecture of the churches in the countryside. The architecture in the churches in the countryside is all kind of quite the same. They have this design, I'll put one on screen, where they don't really have a spire of a church, but the kind of where the spire would be, it's kind of like a gridded system where it's like kind of square bricks going up and up and up. And it almost kind of reminds me of what perhaps Anglo-Saxon churches might have looked like before, you know, a lot of the kind of, even the old churches we'd see now would be built after 1066, and they're built in that kind of stone French design, which you kind of see all over England. And don't get me wrong, that's a lovely design, but you know, the way I've seen and described and drawn of Anglo-Saxon churches, where when you look it up and kind of look at designs of Anglo-Saxon churches, I was thinking, this is what they might have looked like. Now, obviously, there's different materials used with Danish churches. I believe most of them are made out of terracotta clay. Because there was a lack of brick and stone in Denmark, I'm not sure if that's true. That's just what I was told. And aside from the architecture and the landscape and things like that, I just felt very welcomed in Denmark. You know, people were very friendly to me in the city and in the countryside. Shopkeepers, or you know, if I was buying something, a shopkeeper or even people on the street, they'd speak to me in Danish, or like automatically, rather than English, rather than they could sense he's a foreigner. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe I looked like I could have blended in there. Even the language. Danish, I'm not sure if this is a commonly felt experience, but Danish sounds like listening to someone speaking English, but you're far away enough that it sounds muffled and you can't understand it. That's kind of what Danish sounds like. I'd just constantly be turning my head and thinking, sounds like someone speaking English. And then I turn around and listen and I'm like, that's not English. But it sounds so familiar to English. And in sum, all this feeling of commonality and familiarity and welcomeness in Denmark, my mind constantly went to Beowulf. Because I think Beowulf's quite a well-known story. I'm not really going to go into detail about the story at all. But to talk about the story of Beowulf itself very, very briefly, the hero Beowulf travels from Gotland, yeah, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is kind of Gotland in the south of Sweden. He travels to Denmark to aid the Danes in helping to defeat the kind of dragon monster. Which is kind of like, that's the most short summary I could ever give of the story. But it's not the story itself that's important in this situation. You know, I always thought as a kid, like, when I first read it when I was really young, and I thought, like, why is it an English story if it's, you know, set in Sweden/Denmark? But then obviously, as you understand, as you get older and you kind of read into history a bit, the story was most likely told orally throughout these tribes, and the tribes that came from northern Germany and Denmark, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians, would have all known this story orally, and then would have taken it to England with them, and therefore England interacting, you know, with these tribes interacting with a Christian culture, where you'd have monks who are writing things down, wrote the story down, and then the story became the first written piece of literature in the English language, in Old English. And to me, it kind of felt like I was almost retracing the steps of history and of literature, of English literature and English history. And I was kind of like stepping back and getting a sense of rootedness, but also a grasp of kind of the origins of my history and my literature and kind of my language, stepping backwards and realising that a place like Denmark, it is completely unique in its own right. It's its complete own country, but there's this feeling of familiarity and warmth that doesn't go away when you're there. And then when you come home and you kind of let all this coalesce into your mind, I looked back at the trip, the LSD trip, and you kind of just realise that what you kind of maybe search for through chemical alteration, you don't need it at all. it's not something I ever really seeked out anyway, but you know, many people do look for that kind of sense of meaning and sense of self through these kind of things. And you just don't need to, because, you know, in reality, like living and going around in reality and traveling and taking in your senses of smell and sight and touch and hearing, all of these things, and you experiencing a new place, but trying to understand the connections with a place, in particular with a place like Denmark, it gives you a stronger sense of that kind of rootedness and feeling and understanding with yourself, but not just understanding with yourself, understanding within a language and a people and literature, and not just one people's literature, but in this case two and more. And I suppose Denmark gave a tangible sense of rootedness and feeling and understanding, as compared to the kind of abstract, purely mental stroke visual kind of sense of temporary rootedness that I received through LSD. And when I sat back and looked at all this, I kind of realised, you know, that rootedness, it doesn't come from psychedelica. You know, it comes from retracing steps and retracing literature and learning of origins, and just simply, not even all that, just simply travelling and taking in your senses. Even, you know, you don't even need to travel far, just travel out to your local countryside, just take in your senses, learn a bit of local history, learn a bit of understanding of the area you live in, because through that you learn a bit more about yourself and where your origins come from, but also how a place makes you feel as a person, the place you inhabit, what was it like X amount of time ago, and it slowly kind of builds a tapestry in your mind of what a place means to a community, but also to yourself. And through that, you slowly begin to understand yourself a bit more. And I think ultimately, the answers and kind of symbols we seek in life, that we sometimes kind of run after and chase after, they aren't something to be chased, but are kind of things you often find in the places you might least expect.